want to talk about the Middle East. We've talked about it circuitously, but you are a critic of Israel. And I want to transpose your comments about being a critic of America to being a critic of Israel. Israel has its ideals that it claims to want to live up to use your phrasing. Would you acknowledge that not only Israel's ideals, but the level it has achieved those ideals, its reality, is morally superior than its neighbors in the Arab world? Do you believe that Israel is a morally superior country than Iran or Syria or even Egypt?
In some respects, in other respects not.
Like what?
Well, for example, as compared with the others that you mentioned, Israel is a very aggressive state. For example, it's invaded Lebanon 5 times. Iran hasn't invaded anyone. Israel is now in a gross violation of international law. The occupation has been, the actions of Israel in the occupied territories have been harshly condemned by the Security Council of the United Nations. In fact, Israel is violating its directives. The International Court of Justice has, in its advisory opinion, concluded that these are in violation of fundamental international law. Those are quite negative facts. On the other hand, internally, if you ask, is Israel internally more open, democratic, less repressive than, say, Egypt? Yeah, sure, obviously so. That's why I'm a very harsh critic of the Egyptian dictatorship.
Last question, Professor. The U.S. State Department defines anti-Semitism as holding Israel to a double standard, that is, pointing out, criticizing, attacking things only in Israel and not criticizing them elsewhere. I'm not phrasing it exactly, but that's the gist of it. Do you think that by obsessing over Israel, you mentioned various UN hearings and investigations, do you think that the world's obsession with Israel, while ignoring similar prosecutions or examinations or condemnations of Bashar Assad or the Islamic State, do you think that's a sign of anti-Semitism? And do you think anti-Semitism is on the rise in the world?
That's like asking me, do I agree that the moon is made out of green cheese? First of all, it's not a fact. There's an overwhelming opposition to the Islamic State, to Assad, bitterly condemned. How can you say that they're not criticized? I mean, it's just overwhelming, including in the Islamic world.
But in terms of formal UN resolutions, in terms of war crimes inspections, in terms of the International Criminal Court, in terms of the sheer number of resolutions, in terms of dealing with refugees, if you compare the inspection, criticism, and condemnation and resolutions against Israel for its occupation compared to Syria,
Which occupation of Syria are you referring to?
Well, let's say its treatment of refugees, its treatment of minorities.
Syria has been amazing in its treatment of refugees. If we would only live up to that standard, it would be astonishing. I'm not talking about the last couple of years during the Civil War, but before that, the countries that absorbed refugees at a huge level were Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Iran. And these, incidentally, are refugees often from our crimes. We don't absorb the refugees from our crimes. They do. So several million people fled Iraq after the U.S. attack. Did they come to the United States? No. They were absorbed, not beautifully, I mean, pretty in harsh ways sometimes, but they were absorbed in the neighboring countries. We don't do that.
Is anti-Semitism on the rise, Professor? And I'll let you go after this, but I am curious. Do you believe that anti-Semitism in Europe and in the Middle East is on the rise?
Well, you have to be very careful here. Anti-Semitism and criticism of the policies of Israel are two very different things.
Let's talk about Jew hatred. Let's just phrase it that way. Do you think hatred of Jews, Jewish things, synagogues, Jewish schools, Jewish people is on the rise in Europe and the Middle East?
The Middle East is a complicated affair because remember that the situation in the Middle East is that the United States Israel with U.S. backing, crucial U.S. backing, is carrying out what the Israeli sociologist Baruch Kummerling called politicides, destroying the national rights of a national group. That's pretty serious. So in the Middle East, there's all kind of reactions to that. In Europe, there is a rise of right-wing, sometimes neo-Nazi forces, which does sometimes take an anti-Semitic...
Right-wing? What about the attacks in Paris, in Copenhagen? Are you calling Muslim extremists right-wing, Professor? Is that a code word? Will you address the Muslim anti-Semitism?
About the rise of I can just go into it in detail if you like. Those particular cases, which incidentally were massively condemned by the Muslim communities, both in Paris and in Denmark, and in fact, just the other day in Norway, there were 1,000 Muslims surrounding a synagogue in protecting it, in condemnation of the attack in Copenhagen. But if you look at these attacks, just take a look at who the people were. You can find out, for example, there's a detailed discussion in the current issue of France's leading international affairs journal, Le Monde Diplomatique. They go through the background of the assailants in Paris. They're Algerian, they come from the slums, they are products of the bitter Algerian atrocities in the 1990s, from which their parents fled, for which France had very significant, played a very significant role. It was supporting the military regime, and the groups that these young men came out of the protest against that, those actions. They live in very marginalized, repressed regions in Paris. They've been in and out of prisons. They've been involved in the kind of crime that comes from repression and marginalization. It's a pretty ugly situation.
Professor, it sounds like you're either trying to...
But they did, but...
You're avoiding it. I mean, are you avoiding it, or are you excusing it, or are you denying it? Do you deny that there's a rise in Muslim anti-Semitism in Europe?
Neither denying it nor avoiding it, trying to understand it.
So you acknowledge it exists and is growing.
It's very easy to scream at people you don't like. It's more serious to try to understand what they're doing and take constructive actions to prevent it. If you want to scream, that's fine. You can always scream at your enemies.
Professor, I've enjoyed our conversation today. You've been very generous with your time. I thank you. It's nice to meet you via Skype. And we call ourselves the Rebels over here too, so we're dissidents in our own way. Great to talk to you today, Professor.
Nice to talk to you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.